there are a number of different strategies available to benefit these slow-growing pigs that we identify early on. So it should be a combined strategy rather than, one particular intervention. You should be focusing on these pigs at several different points during their early life in order to give them the best chance of catching up.
It's time for a new era of communication in the swine industry, one that you can get the latest updates while commuting or driving to farms. Here you will have the brightest minds of the global swine industry in your pocket. 𝗦𝗱𝗶𝗶 podcast is only possible with the support of forward-looking and innovative sponsors like 𝘴𝘵𝗰𝗸𝘏, a simple yet powerful pig health and production management tool. 𝘱𝘪𝘊, always one step ahead in swine feeding. 𝘵𝗫𝗄𝗏 provides programs and services to help producers achieve their targets in a high-quality, safe, and sustainable way. NutriQuest, experts serving producers and delivering breakthrough solutions. Genesis, the first power in genetics. Zinpro, essential trace minerals, exceptional performance.
Welcome to 𝗦𝗱𝗶𝗶 podcast. My name is 𝗪𝗱𝗶𝗶 𝗵𝗀𝗋, your host for today's episode.
This episode's sponsor highlight is about NutriQuest. NutriQuest delivers targeted breakthrough solutions to animal producers via nutritional and non-nutritional products, services, and technologies. At NutriQuest, we believe in ingenuity inspired by servitude, and that our success comes from helping producers realize improved profitability through optimized technologies and efficient operation.
Hello everyone, today we have Dr. Sadie Douglas, and she's expert on the whole area of early pig growth and lifetime performance. How are you today, Dr. Douglas?
I'm really good, thank you. Thank you very much for having me on your podcast.
Yeah, I appreciate you being here today, especially in this very crazy times that we are going through right now. So
yeah.
Cool. Well, the first question I have, Sadie, is if you can tell us about your career and how you got involved in pig production as well.
Yeah, certainly. So I grew up in a county in the UK called Northumberland. And basically from an early age, I had a love of animals and worked on a few different farms. When I went to university, I therefore decided to carry on working with animals. And I went to the Royal Veterinary College in London, where I did an undergraduate degree in Bioveterinary Sciences, and then went on to do a master's in the Control of Infectious Diseases in animals. And actually that master's had quite a large component focusing on livestock. Mm-hmm. So once I graduated, I actually moved back up to the north of England and took up a Ph.D. at Newcastle University. Mm-hmm. And this was all around focusing on the management of variation in the pig systems and coming up with different strategies, whether management or nutritional, to try and improve the growth performance of these really slow growing pigs.
Very nice.
So after I finished my PhD back in 2014 now, I actually stayed within the pig industry, and I went to work for a company that specialised in ventilation controllers in pig production, in pig houses. Mm-hmm. So what I was actually doing there was something quite different, is I was managing their data services as we had streams of data coming from essentially smart farms. Mm-hmm. So we had temperature sensors, water meters, growth data, health data, wow. And it was my job to analyze this data, mm-hmm. and hopefully, give pig producers some practical guidance from the data about what they can do on farm to improve things.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's super cool.
Yeah, it was really interesting few years, and definitely an area that I think is getting, it's progressing more and more and will become an important part, I think, of pig production in the future.
Mm. Very cool.
Yeah. And then after that, about a year and a half, 2 years ago, I actually moved to a company called Primary Diet, where I'm currently a piglet nutritionist. So mm-hmm. we supply piglet pre-starter and starter feed. So usually focusing on the first 2 to 3 weeks post-weaning. And yeah, we supply feed to the UK, to Europe, and also further afield to countries such as Canada and Asia as well. So I've been there for a couple of years now, and obviously it's kind of taken me back to my initial focus from my research, which is all about how to improve growth performance of pigs through nutrition and management in their early life, really.
Very cool. Yeah, super diverse background there, and very cool areas that you've studied. I've told you before that I've watched your research for the last 5 or 6 years, and that was super cool. So what are the top 3 lessons from all your research, Sadie?
So I would say that as a result of my PhD, which, as I said, is focusing on improving the growth performance of those really slow-growing pigs. Mm-hmm. So what I learned was actually that the early period of a pig's life is really critical when it comes to reducing that variation. So if you leave it too long to intervene, you're unlikely to be able to get the benefits that you want. So I always say that intervene as early as possible. So potentially we're talking at birth. And you need to have a think about what are the additional stresses that you're placing on those pigs. And then hopefully try to reduce those stresses, and that can help those pigs to try and catch up with heavier litter mates or heavier pen mates, for example, at weaning.
Yeah, interesting.
I'd also say that, sometimes it's an opinion that we have or that we hear is that if a piglet, for example, is born with a low birth weight, that, they're simply a lost cause and that actually they're never going to be able to catch up. Certainly as a result of my research, I'd say that that's definitely not the case.
Right.
And we can implement a number of different strategies to help those piglets. And actually, in some cases, these pigs can exhibit growth rates that are above average. We just have to give them the additional support that they need. And I'd also say when you consider low birth weight piglets or you consider low weaning weight piglets, they're not all the same. So we tend to just group them, all together and say, they're less than so many kilograms and they're classified as a low birth weight piglet. Mm-hmm. But actually, there's a difference in these pigs. So you may have some that are small at birth because they were restricted in the uterus. Mm-hmm. So they had insufficient nutrients and therefore they are born substantially smaller. Whereas you may have piglets that have a low birth weight but did not experience restriction in the uterus, or experience a much lesser degree of restriction. Mm-hmm. And actually, there is a difference in how well these piglets can catch up. So it's important to consider the cause of low birth weight or the cause of low weaning weight, and not just group all these pigs into one category.
Very cool.
And then I would finally say that there are a number of different strategies available to benefit these slow-growing pigs that we identify early on. So I would be considering what you can do for them pre-weaning, and I'll go on to explain a few things about that in a bit. And then also post-weaning. So it should be a combined strategy rather than one particular intervention. You should be focusing on these pigs at several different points during their early life in order to give them the best chance of catching up.
Very cool. No, that makes sense. And one thing that caught my attention a lot on your research was that if you divide the pigs, say, in 5 categories or however many, they change their categories a lot throughout the growing period, right?
Yeah, definitely. So it's not static. It's, as I said before, just because we classify a piglet as small at birth and then potentially small at weaning doesn't actually necessarily mean that they're going to be the smallest if you do, an intermediate weight in the grower period or the smallest at finishing. And likewise, just because a piglet is born with a heavier birth weight or has a heavier weaning weight does not mean that they are going to be the fastest growers and therefore the heaviest pigs to finish. There's actually quite a lot of movement within that, because there's obviously different factors that are affecting these piglets at different stages. So when we're considering strategies, although you have to go with, the majority, and we have to try and understand the most important risk factors for these pigs, it's important to understand that there's movement in these categories and there are things that we can do to help them.
Right, very cool. Well, Sadie, what would be the most important risk factors associated with poor lifetime performance?
So again, I would say from my research, this is, if we're looking at weight, for example, which tend to come out as the most important risk factors for poor lifetime growth performance. So birth weight is obviously one of them. Now, as I said before, we know that potentially a pig which is born with a low birth weight may have been restricted in the uterus. And with that comes a number of different complications. They may be at, for example, higher risk of mortality. They are, because of the low birth weight, they're more likely to get competition from heavier litter mates. They're more likely to have access to the poorest teats on the sow as well, and therefore, get less milk.
Right.
And there may be physiological differences actually for these pigs as well. So birth weight is definitely one of the major ones. And we do consistently see that some small pigs at birth will be the lowest weight pigs at finish. But as you've brought it previously, actually there is movement within these categories. So that's why weaning weight is another really important risk factor actually for poor lifetime growth. So when we talk about a group of pigs at weaning that have a low weaning weight, what we're probably capturing is a number of pigs that were born with a low birth weight, but then actually also pigs that were potentially born with an average birth weight or a heavier birth weight, but for whatever reason have been disadvantaged during the pre-weaning period and now have a low weaning weight. And actually, we know that, therefore, weaning weight as well, in addition to birth weight, is an important factor to consider. And I'd probably just add another one, actually, that didn't come out of my research, but has come out of work done at Primary Diet to the company that I work for since. And that's actually the importance of weaning age.
Right.
So in the UK, we tend to wean pigs at around an average of 26 to 28 days. So I know that's obviously later than, for example, in the US.
Right.
But what we found from our research at Primary is actually that the impact of an early weaned pig is greater than the impact of being small at weaning. So, and this was purely in relation to nursery growth performance, but it's likely that pattern will be continued to finishing. And actually, for those pigs that are going to be the worst off, it's those piglets that are early weaned and are also small. So they're the ones that are really going to struggle in terms of performance.
Interesting. So if I understood correctly, in that study, you saw that age was more important than weight. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. So this was in some access to some trial data that we completed over a number of years. And certainly it was those early weaned pigs, which we classified at approximately 20 to 24 days. The impact of being an early weaned pig was greater than being a lighter pig. And actually, I guess if you think about it, it does make sense, because if a pig is younger, then actually they're going to have had less time to suckle on the sow. They're going to have had less time to eat creep feed, which we know is incredibly important to stimulate gut development, and therefore they may struggle more at weaning. And then actually, in terms of development of the piglet's gut, there's nothing better than time. So if we're giving, potentially an older pig, their guts had more time to develop than a younger pig, and therefore would we expect them to do better? Yeah, I think we probably would.
Right. That makes sense. And I think that goes, there's some study out of Michigan State from Dr. 𝗏𝗪 about similar things from a physiological standpoint. That's cool. Very nice. I wanted to get your thoughts in a few other topics here. One is about the whole variation, right? Which, of course, we hear a lot of producers, everyone talking about, hey, how can I reduce the variation on my pigs? But also we see a lot of studies trying to find, fix some of the variation, and it's extremely hard. So I wanted to see your thoughts on that. One of my thoughts is that, hey, pigs start at about 22 to sometimes 25% variation, and all the way to market, they're about 10, 12%. So half of the problem they fix by themselves. But I mean, from an overall standpoint, I don't know, based on your research, if there's major things to help on the whole coefficient of variation standpoint.
Yeah, so certainly for a lot of my research, it was all focused on trying to obviously reduce the variation. And the method that I took to reduce that variation was to improve the performance of the slowest growing pigs. Mm-hmm. And certainly a lot of the research that I did and the studies that I wrote, we were always looking essentially to try and reduce that coefficient of variation, whatever our group of pigs was. So if it was pre-weaning and it was the litter, or if it was post-weaning, it was a group of pigs. And yeah, I certainly, as a result of my PhD, had several different strategies that helped to reduce that variation at different points within the production system. And again, these were mainly around early strategies, focusing on reducing this variation as soon as possible to have the maximum output longer term.
How about compensatory growth? I know we talked about it, right? But it's also like a polemic topic, and I just wanted to get your thoughts, based on your research and our experience. What's your take on the whole compensatory growth discussion?
Yeah, so I think that remains to be quite a difficult topic, and definitely, everybody has their different opinions. And I mean, I guess the way I like to think of it is that I don't necessarily believe in the concept of compensatory growth. Mm-hmm. What I do believe is that we can enable pigs to increase their weight as a result of different strategies, and then that may result in them either retaining that weight advantage, or actually they may lose it depending on what other stresses they come across later on in life. I think the problem with compensatory growth, and the issue I have with it, is that people assume that they can then have these stresses on a pig and the pig will somehow compensate for those and make up for them. And I don't really like that as a strategy, to be honest, because I don't feel we should be relying on something like that.
Interesting. No, that is super interesting, and it's a topic that I also enjoy a lot. I mean, there's some work from the University of Illinois on the early 2000s about how sometimes, more often than not, it sounds like they can catch up, but it depends, right? Depends on the type of stress and everything.
Exactly.
Super interesting. Cool. So from a producer standpoint, if we get more practical here, Sadie, what can producers implement based on what you've learned?
Okay, so what I would say is that while I've kind of identified a number of different strategies, and while I find a number of different strategies work on farm, it ultimately depends on the individual pig producer and the unit that they work on, because there's so many different variables. So it is important to consult, whoever you have advising you on farm, whether that's a geneticist or a nutritionist, to identify some of these strategies that would work on your unit. But what I have found in general, if you're looking at strategies to improve the growth performance in the pre-weaning period, so potentially those piglets with low birth weight, mm-hmm. then it's really important that you identify those piglets, those small birth weight piglets at birth, and they can benefit from being cross-fostered onto a litter with other small pigs. So what we're trying to do at that point is reduce the competition that those small birth weight piglets are exposed to. And what I would say, actually, a really interesting piece of research that came out of Newcastle University, where I went a few years later, was the importance of targeted cross-fostering. Mm. So while we know that there's a benefit from putting small pigs onto other litters with small pigs, mm-hmm. actually we don't want to inadvertently disadvantage heavier pigs by doing that, because this particular piece of research showed that if we, for example, then take big pigs and put them onto litters with other big pigs, that can disadvantage their weaning weight. So I would always suggest a strategy of targeted cross-fostering. So think about your small pigs, get them onto several litters together, but try not to cross-foster other litters if possible.
Mm-hmm. No, that makes sense.
Yeah, and then also think about the nutrition for these pigs. So now that you've got them into litters where you can keep a closer eye on them, have a think about what additional nutrition may benefit them. So I would always recommend to creep feed these piglets. And certainly my research was looking at milk supplementation, so whether there was any benefit to these litters in providing milk. Now, I'd say the research was inconclusive in that it did show a benefit in terms of reducing the variation within a litter of small birth weight pigs, but there wasn't necessarily an advantage in weaning weight. So I would always caution with milk supplementation. There could be a benefit, but ultimately it will depend on how well that sow is milking and potentially how big your litter size is as well.
Interesting. Do you, from your data, when you did a milk supplementation, did any change that happened, did that stay all the way to market or that went away?
No, so in the case of milk supplementation, it tends to be short-lived. And I think actually some of that is supported by the research. And I think the field of milk supplementation, the research is very variable. So in some cases there is a benefit and others there is not. And I would say that's all potentially down to sow factors about how well that sow is milking. And I would caution that you may not see that benefit long term, or certainly that's what my research suggested.
Yeah, that makes sense. What I think, right around weaning, any strategy that can help with improving survivability, it's great, right? Because a live pig is a live pig, so that's right there.
Exactly.
A lot of things related to growth, it's way more variable from what I've seen.
Yeah, definitely. It gets a lot more complicated. And actually that's a really good point, in that often what we find with something like milk supplementation is that it does help to keep piglets alive. And, you'll be able to wean a greater number of piglets, but actually, the impact on weaning weight or post-weaning performance is more variable.
Very good, Sadie. Well, anything else on this topic before we move to the 3 questions we ask every guest every episode?
So, I'd probably just say that obviously we've kind of talked about pre-weaning strategies, but what is also incredibly important is post-weaning strategies. And as part of my research, I looked at the best way to feed these pigs that are lightweight at weaning. So those pigs that have a lower birth weight or may have been, have a low weaning weight for other reasons. And actually, it showed that it's beneficial to separate piglets by size at weaning and feed them accordingly. So feed your piglets that are smaller at weaning, feed them a more nutrient-dense regime, feed them increased amounts of feed as well. And actually, that can really help them in order to kind of meet the weights of their contemporaries. And what I would say actually is that often we find that in the first, say, 1 to 2 weeks post-weaning, we may find that actually small pigs outgrow or have higher growth rates than their heavier litter mates. And we think that's because essentially the big pigs, which we tend to call the milk babies, so they're the ones that probably had the access to the best teats, had the most milk, and probably didn't eat that much creep feed. And therefore they tend to struggle a little bit at weaning, and they don't eat feed as quickly as the small pigs. So I always think that if we can exploit that period where those small piglets are weaning are growing faster by also giving them access to a better feed regime, then it can just close the gap between them and the bigger pigs as well. Interesting.
Yeah, you touched on another topic that's fairly polemic around the globe. Maybe I think at least here in the US, I see pretty much everyone on the same page, which is, okay, should we sort the pigs by size or not, right?
Yeah.
Placement at nursery or finishing. And there's a few studies, one it's like probably 15 years old, and a few other ones more recent, where what we've seen is that if we sort by size at nursery and finishing, they lose some performance because they fight more, right? They take a little longer to establish their social hierarchy. We see a lot of producers in the US doing is after a few days, when you figure out which pigs are not eating, then you separate them and you try to help them out. from that standpoint.
Yeah, and certainly that's, it definitely is a good strategy as well. And it's a really difficult area because we know at weaning we're putting a number of different stresses on those pigs. So,
Right.
We're taking them away from their mums. We're potentially, we are mixing them. We do know that mixing is a stress, and it does cause, as you say, it can cause issues with aggression. It can take, a few days for that group of piglets to establish itself again. What I would say, certainly in the case of those small pigs at weaning, is that hopefully any disadvantage that you have by remixing those pigs is outweighed by the benefit of feeding them better and being able to give them essentially more attention. Although I suppose when you do that, when you make the decision, whether you do it at weaning or whether you delay it by a couple of days, I guess it's down to preference.
Very interesting. Well, this is great research that you've done, Dr. Douglas. Really appreciate your thoughts in all these areas. Anything else before we jump into the 3 questions?
No, I think that's kind of the key areas we've covered. But yeah, really interesting.
It is time to our famous 3.
Celebrating its 25th anniversary, 𝗪𝗏 manufactures the original wireless standalone swine feeding system, designed by pork producers for pork producers. They are simple, reliable, and provide peace of mind 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. 𝗪𝗏 is not just manufactured by an equipment company, but by a family pork production business with a slat-level understanding. 𝗪𝗏, always one step ahead in swine feeding. For knowledge and news from the global swine industry, access our partner, 𝗵𝗵𝗂𝗏.com.
So the first question, Sadie, is what's your favorite pig-related book?
So my favourite book is one called Science and Practice of Pig Production. This was actually written or edited by my Ph.D. supervisor, and it's just a great book to give you the science behind raising pigs, as well as giving you the more practical side of it.
Very nice. How about a book in general outside of pig production?
So I'm quite a big fan of historical fiction, and we have a writer in the UK called 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏, and he has written a series of books all about Genghis Khan. One of his books called 𝗏𝗏𝗶𝗲 𝗵𝗱𝗆 would be my favorite book.
Very nice. Very cool. And then the last one is, what do you think sets apart successful swine professionals from those who are not?
I would always say passion for the industry and passion for what you do. So if you love pigs, and for example, if you're a nutritionist and you love science and you have a real passion for the industry and wanting to improve things, then I definitely think this is what makes a difference when it comes to those who are successful and those who aren't.
I love it. Very good. Dr. Douglas, thanks so much for our time today. We really appreciate that.
Thank you very much for having me.
Hey everyone, please share our episodes with as many people as you can so we can continue to impact the life of swine professionals from around the globe with the wisdom of our great guests. Before you go, make sure to get in our waitlist for the Swine Talks Web Conference, the first online conference of the global swine industry, an update on hot topics, and we even gonna have some controversial topics of the global swine industry, so you can leverage that knowledge in your day-to-day. Go to swinetalks.com and get on our waitlist. We'll talk soon.